Thomas Dunn says, "We are marked by loneliness when we register the death of others to us, when we cease to be connected to the things that surround us, and when we notice that we somehow have become something that we no longer recognize as ourselves." He goes on to say the worst aspect of loneliness is that it ends the possibility of meaningful experience. Very philosophical way. You might want to pause and think about those, but they are quite insightful statements. Sam Wells, whose book Incarnational Ministry has been such a help in my thinking for today, says loneliness is the most explicit way in which we name our inability to be content in being with ourselves. So our reading today, our gospel reading today, finds its place in a chapter about the fleeting nature of material possessions and the danger of becoming too attached to worldly things. Kenneth Bailey suggests a bigger issue than just money or materialism is at play in this marvelous little parable. He says it is a reflection on society, on human isolation, and on loneliness. It was such a helpful lens when I read that sentence. It helped me look at this parable in such a different way. Perhaps you could think of it in the same way today. So let's go through it with that in mind. In the opening scene, we meet a rich man. In the first verse, we are told the land of the rich man produced abundantly. We are not told that he worked hard, although it's possible that he might have. The point of the sentence is he, like all of us, does not deserve this great abundance that has come upon him. It is a gift of the land. And it wouldn't be unfair to say, therefore, it is a gift from God. We are also told that he is rich before this bumper crop arrives. In other words, he already has more than he needs, but now there's even more upon more. The next scene, which is the next verse, paints a picture, and we think of this as a movie or a stage play. The next scene is this tragic one. We read in verse 17, he thought to himself, "What should I do, for I have no place to store my crops?" Now, we don't want to make more of this than we should, but we do notice in that simple verse the isolation and the loneliness of the man. It is a common English phrase, I recognize that, but the simple phrase, he thinks to himself. It speaks, it echoes loneliness. He doesn't consult with anyone, he doesn't turn to friends or family, he doesn't even pray. He just thinks to himself. And he doesn't seem to have any sense of responsibility for anyone or to anyone. Even though he has more than enough, it doesn't seem to cross his mind that he maybe could give his abundance away, that he might give what he has to those who have less, and particularly could give to those who have nothing. His primary concern, his only concern, in fact, is, I have no place to store my crops. And even that phrase is more than that, because we find the words my crops. He doesn't see the crops as being a gift, which he now has the privilege to steward. He doesn't receive the gifts. He doesn't receive the crop as a gift. These crops for him are his possession. The minute they were there, they became his. And so quite ironically, in this moment, in so many ways, he has everything, and yet at the same time, he truly has nothing. Scene 3, the next verse tells us what his solution is to his dilemma. And his solution is build bigger barns. And in truth, it's a devastating conclusion to come to. Because what bigger barns means is that he now definitely doesn't need anyone else in his life. He will say in a moment that he can skip many harvests if he wants to. He's got more than enough stored up. If there was a bad crop, he wouldn't need help from anyone. He wouldn't need to borrow. He wouldn't need to draw in assistance. He doesn't even need to pray. He doesn't need God. He can go with a drought for years and he would still be fine because he's got bigger barns. Listen to the rhythm of that third sentence. Then he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. I, and my. He has everything, and yet truly has nothing. The fourth movement of the story describes the vision that he has for his life in the light of this newfound abundance. He says, I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry. It's not hard to notice to whom he speaks. Not to his family, not to his friends, not to God. There seems to be no one else to speak to except his soul, his inner being. And when he speaks to himself, he says, I can now relax. I can eat as much as I like. I can drink as much as I like. I can be merry as much as I like. But by all accounts, it appears that he will do all of those things on his own. And perhaps the most disturbing part of it all is he seems tragically content that he is isolated with all his stuff. It seems to be, in this moment, sufficient. But then the last scene, if we're thinking of a stage play, the last scene is this climactic, dramatic moment. God appears on the stage, and God says to him, you fool. We're not used to God speaking to us like that. We're not used to hearing God speak that kind of language to anyone. It's not an insult. It's not an insult, as we'll see in a moment. There's a real sense in which it's simple truth. You fool. This very night your life is being demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? Do you notice that? The question is not what will happen to your possessions. The question is whose. In other words, to which person, to whom will these things be given? And God asks him a relational question. God asks him not so much about what's stored in the bigger barns, but it's about what relationships do you have to whom this prosperity can go. Death comes to all of us, of course. But for this man, isolated in life, he now inevitably is isolated in death. Sam Wells again says he set out to insulate himself from death, but instead insulated himself from life, both now and indeed forever. And God rightly calls him a fool. As I said earlier, it's not an insult. He's a fool, for he has wasted his precious life by choosing to be isolated from God and from others, by choosing to be isolated from life, by choosing to simply build bigger barns and do nothing else with his life. Now, the other part of this that is significant is we need to remember that most of the people who listened to Jesus were poorer people. They would never have had to, and at best maybe middle class, they would never have had to wrestle with deciding to build bigger barns. Jesus is not talking to those kind of wealthy people. So why would Jesus tell a story about an unimaginably wealthy man to a mostly poor and middle class audience? Well, I think the answer is simple. Because the parable isn't just for the hyper wealthy. The parable is for all of us about how, whoever we are, how we choose to live our lives. The reality is, many people live lonely lives. And the primary reason people live lonely lives is, quite ironically, because more than anything, I think at some level they try to avoid life. And so they live disconnected, isolated lives. When we live in a nation as our own, and we live in a world as it is at the moment, and life comes with all of its troubles, when life is distressing, it's tempting to withdraw. And if life is dull, if I can use the word boring, if life just doesn't seem to have much purpose to it, then we look for distractions. And so if you look across the world, you'll find many people who either have withdrawn from life or are distracted in the midst of life. The man in our parable, of course, is the latter. He has lots of money, but he has no purpose. And so he fills his life with distractions, more money, means more gluttony, means more drinking, means more alone. But either way, whether we are living life withdrawn through our distresses or distracted by our dullness, the temptation ends up being the same. We are tempted as people to disconnect from the world, from life. And it's in our efforts to avoid the reality of our world, again, let me say, the distressing part of our life or the dull part of our life, our desire to disconnect from that is what inevitably ends up leaving us lonely, disconnected from others and from God. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the word self-loathing, but self-loathing is a more common malady than perhaps we realize in our society today. You can be absolutely sure, no matter how many people choose to watch this video, that someone who watches this video is a person who struggles with self-loathing. And when I speak these words in church on Sunday, we can be sure that there are people in the pew who are struggling with self-loathing. And people often dislike themselves for at least two reasons. They often dislike themselves because of some shortcoming, a sense of failure in life, failure to excel, or failure to succeed in business, or failure to fit in a group, or failure to keep up with whatever others are doing. People often hate themselves for not being who they wish they could be. I see it, by the way, quite a lot, even just as clergy, as we compare ourselves to others and how other people are doing in ministry. It's easy to end up kind of going, I'm no good, I'm no good, I'm no good. I even think the booming cosmetic surgery industry is in many ways a reflection of high levels of self-loathing in our society, people who can't live happily with how they are. That's one kind of way in which I think people loathe themselves. There's another kind of way in which people dislike themselves, and that is because they dislike themselves for who they fundamentally are. If you like, they dislike the people they have become, their character, their nature. And so people find themselves committing sins which they deeply regret, or they recognize within themselves an almost uncontrollable selfishness or an unlikability, or a cruelty or meanness towards others, perhaps even especially the poor, and so on. Just picking one of the emotions that emerges in this kind of thing, if you just think about it as an illustration, if you've ever experienced true guilt, you will know that guilt has the capacity to induce a deep self-hatred, a deep dislike for yourself. So it may not be true for everyone watching today, and I recognize that, but I know for sure that there are many people in our world who think so poorly of themselves so often. And that breeds a deep loneliness in our world. And it's not new, it's not foreign. In fact, the Psalms are filled with a number of prayers of people, of psalmists, of poets who write out of their own deep self-loathing and struggle. That immaculate Psalm 130 begins with the words, "Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. Lord, hear my voice out of the depths." Through our parable today, Jesus warns us that to face the challenges of life by simply burying our heads in the sand, whether that sand is bigger barns or whatever else it is, however else we distract ourselves in life or withdraw in life, that when we do that, we will inevitably isolate ourselves from God. And if we isolate ourselves from God, we will be isolating ourselves from others. One of the great gifts that Alcoholics Anonymous has given to the world is that beautiful Serenity Prayer. The alcoholic who wants to be well understands two things more vividly than most of the rest of us. The alcoholic understands that they cannot recover, they cannot be well without the help of God. Some call him a higher power, but they know they cannot do it without him. And the second thing they realize, which is critical, and I really want you to hear this today, they also recognize that they cannot do it without each other, which is why there are Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. It's not just published in the book. They need God and they need each other. And that's a deep, deep biblical truth for all of us. And so for you today, I want to say, if you are one of the lonely, perhaps you're one of the self-loathing, perhaps you're simply feeling in your world isolated, I want to leave you with this one thing to do this week, just one thing. And may I invite you to spend at least the next week praying the Serenity Prayer every day. Even if it's just for a week, won't you make that commitment to pray it every day? Let me walk you through just the 3 sentences briefly. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. The other day, my grandson was showing me some of his drawings. He loves to draw. And I told him how fantastic I thought he was, because I could never draw like that. We think he's got a wonderful gift with drawing. So I said to him, I could never draw like that. And he said to me, he was absolutely sure I could. So I said, yeah, give me a pencil. And I tried to draw a dog for him. And I mean this, I'm not making this up. At first he looked at me with a look that was incredulous. And then he genuinely seemed worried about me, as if something was seriously wrong with me, as if I'd had some kind of episode, because my dog drawing was so bad. I'm not an artist. I never will be. It's something I cannot change. I cannot change my past. I might be able to change some of the behaviors that led to some of the things in my past, but I cannot change the consequences or the choices that I've made over the course of my now quite long life. There just are some things, the list is longer than that, but there just are some things we cannot change. So we ask God to grant us the serenity to accept ourselves in the midst of that truth. The second part of the prayer is, and God grant us the courage to change the things we can. Grant us the courage to change the things we can. Now, of course, my guess is, if it's what's true for me, it must be true for you, I'm sure, that the list of things we can change is much longer than the things we cannot change. Again, we can't go through the whole list, but I can, for example, repent of my sins. And I mean repent not in the sense of just say I'm sorry, but I can change my ways. With God's help, I can change my ways. There is the possibility for change. I also don't have to live with my character flaws. We can be tempted to say, I've inherited them, or I've had that kind of upbringing or whatever, and so I've got these character flaws, but I don't have to live with them. There is the capacity for change. I don't have to be selfish. I don't have to be unkind. I don't have to be grumpy. I don't have to be racist. I don't have to be sexist just because I was raised in a context that maybe those things were normal. It's very important that we don't bury our heads in the sand and lie about the fact that we cannot change. There are some things that we can change. And then what for me is always the most important part of this prayer is the sentence, and the wisdom to know the difference. This for me is the heart of the matter, because it really is the prayer that I will learn to accept myself as I am, with all my limitations. Help me, Lord, to see that these are the things that I am. This is who I am. This is what my history has been. These things cannot change, and help me to come to terms with that and to accept it and to find your love in the midst of it. But it's also a prayer that God would search my heart and search your heart, and let him, to use the psalmist's words, see if there's any wicked way in us which needs his help and which needs our cooperation with God to help us to change, because there are things which we can change. It's a prayer to go, Lord, help me to know the difference between those two things so that I don't bail on one or the other. It's a prayer, to put it differently, it's a prayer which asks, Lord, let me know that I am loved as I am, and Lord, also love me in a way to not allow me to stick my head in the sand. Confront me, challenge me, so that I will confront these things in my life that need changing. So, dear friends, to come to a rapid conclusion, let me say, don't live your life for the sake of bigger barns. Jesus says, don't be a fool, don't withdraw, don't isolate. Have a better idea for your life than that. God be with you.